Donald Trump wants you fixated on one shiny number, 52%. He wants that number to function like a permission slip for a new war in the Middle East. The screenshot making the rounds, amplified by Trump himself, points to a Just the News item claiming that a majority of likely voters support his decision to strike Iran. That is the play. Grab one favorable top line, repeat it until it hardens into a myth. Then use that myth to bulldoze every uncomfortable question that follows legal authority, strategic objectives, civilian harm, retaliation, risk, and the basic democratic principle that presidents do not get to freelance wars just because their base likes the sound of it. Start with what Trump is actually doing here. He is not informing the public. He is laundering legitimacy. A poll headline becomes a substitute for constitutional process. It is the same MAGA pattern we have watched for years elevate any narrative that flatters Trump's instincts, dismiss counter-evidence as fake, and pressure institutions, Congress, the courts, and the press to treat his latest escalation as normal, inevitable, and popular. But popularity is not legality. And even on the question of popularity, the broader polling landscape looks far less like a mandate and far more like a country that is split, anxious, and increasingly skeptical of Trump's judgment. Within days of the strikes, multiple credible surveys and polling roundups pointed in the opposite direction. They showed more opposition than support, sharp partisan polarization, and widespread doubt that the administration had clearly justified the action. The Associated Press described a public that was divided but trending more negative than positive, with significant concern that the United States was less safe and that the rationale had not been clearly explained. A Quinnipiac poll widely reported found majority opposition to the war and overwhelming opposition to sending ground troops. It also found that many voters believed Trump should have sought congressional approval and that the administration had not clearly explained its reasons. Time magazine likewise summarized early polling showing majorities disapproving of the strikes, while also noting how sharply opinion broke along party lines. In other words, Trump is spotlighting a single friendly result while a wider body of data points to a shakier reality. Americans are not racing to sign up for another open-ended conflict, especially when the reason for the conflict keeps shifting. That brings us to the first sleight of hand, the phrase likely voters. In polling, that term can be meaningful, but it is also a modeling choice. It can tilt results depending on how likely turnout is defined, what assumptions are built in, and whether the sample leans older, whiter, or more partisan than the electorate as a whole. Then add the fact that the Just the News write-up is relaying a poll that many readers will never examine beyond the headline. That is how this information ecosystem works. A number is presented as a verdict, stripped away from methodology, question, wording, timing, and the broader context of what the public is actually being asked to endorse. Are respondents approving a limited strike, a sustained campaign, a mission with clearly defined endpoints, or are they simply reacting to a generic phrase like the decision to strike framed in a way that sounds tough, decisive, and strong, the exact posture Trump knows how to sell? Public opinion is highly sensitive to framing, especially at the start of a conflict before the full costs become visible. A country can rally around a strike in the abstract, then sour quickly. When casualties rise, oil prices spike, allies hesitate, and the mission becomes impossible to explain. And incoherence is exactly what Democrats should hammer here, not as a reflexive anti-war slogan, but as a sober indictment of governance. What is the mission? What is the end state? What is the plan to prevent escalation? What is the strategy for protecting U.S. troops and diplomats across the region from retaliatory attacks? What happens if Iran or Iran-aligned groups target shipping lanes or energy infrastructure? Reuters has reported that lawmakers were briefed and still came away with major unanswered questions about cost, duration, and escalation risk. Questions the administration has not convincingly answered in public. That is not a minor communications failure. That is the core democratic requirement for taking a country into war: clarity, necessity, and accountability, which leads to the constitutional reality Trump wants buried under that 52% confetti. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. Presidents of both parties have stretched that boundary for decades, and both parties have tolerated too much executive drift. But Trump's MAGA project is different in both scale and attitude. It treats constraints as optional and oversight as betrayal. That is why the war powers fight matters. When lawmakers tried to rein in or even scrutinize hostilities, the political system split along familiar partisan lines. Republicans chose loyalty to Trump over institutional prerogative. Even if someone believes in a strong commander-in-chief, the idea that Congress should effectively sign away its Article I role because a president can point to a poll is a dangerous normalization of executive impunity. That is how temporary military actions become long wars. Nobody is forced to take the hard vote. Nobody is forced to have the hard debate. Nobody is forced to accept the hard accountability. And if all of this feels familiar, it should. Americans have lived through modern wars sold with swagger, certainty, and simplified moral language, only to discover later that the costs were underestimated, the intelligence was oversold, and the exit ramps were imaginary. The public remembers that. Trump wants to pretend it does not because his political brand depends on the fantasy that force is always clean, always quick, and always consequence-free when he is the one using it. But reality has a way of intruding. The same polling that shows partisan support for strikes also shows deep anxiety about blowback, including fears of terror attacks and broad resistance to putting boots on the ground. That is not weakness. That is learned caution. Americans have watched leaders promise shock and awe, then deliver years of instability. They have watched veterans cycle through deployments while politicians back home used war as a backdrop for campaign ads. They have watched mission-accomplished rhetoric dissolve into chaos. The electorate's skepticism is not softness. It is memory. It is wisdom earned the hard way. Then there is the second sleight of hand. Trump acts as though a poll about a strike is a poll about him. It is not. Even when people support a discrete military action, that does not automatically translate into trust in Trump's judgment, competence, or honesty. Some of the same public opinion summaries also describe low confidence in Trump's handling of the crisis and persistent concern that the administration has not made its case clearly. That distinction matters because Trump always tries to merge support for an event with endorsement of his leadership. If gas prices spike, he will blame Biden-era policies or the deep state. If the region spirals, he will say the generals misled him. If civilians die, he will point outward, change the subject, and move on. That is not leadership. That is a permanent escape hatch. And the costs here are not theoretical. Energy markets and shipping routes do not care about Trump's social media engagement. Escalation in the Gulf can disrupt oil flows and drive prices higher very quickly, putting pressure on families at the pump and on the wider economy. In a functioning democracy, that reality would force a president to explain why those risks are worth taking and what the plan is to contain them. In MAGA world, it becomes one more excuse to demand obedience, support the commander, or be called unpatriotic. That is how Trump turns war into a loyalty test. This is also why his amplification of just the news is not incidental. It is part of a feedback loop between partisan media and partisan power. Friendly outlets publish the most flattering possible interpretation of events. Trump blasts it out as proof. Republican officials cite Trump's post as evidence of public backing, and the cycle narrows the space for dissent inside the GOP. The goal is not broad persuasion. The goal is party discipline. Anyone who asks hard questions gets branded as weak, disloyal, or somehow aligned with the enemy. The same dynamic played out around January 6th impeachment, the classified document scandal, and the election lies. Once Trump declares the narrative, the party is expected to kneel. Democrats should not argue this as a vague morality play about war and peace. The sharper argument is competence, legality, and national interest. If the administration cannot clearly explain its aims, if it cannot define what success looks like, and if it cannot level with the public about cost and escalation, then it is not exercising the power of war responsibly. And if Trump's answer to congressional oversight is to wave around a poll like a royal decree, then this is no longer only about foreign policy. It is about whether American constitutional government can survive the MAGA theory that one man's will is the nation's will. So yes, Trump can post 52% and dare the country to challenge him. But the real question is not whether a narrow slice of likely voters briefly like the sound of a strike. The real question is whether the United States will keep allowing presidents, especially one as impulsive and self-protective as Trump, to treat war like content and public consent like a headline. Polls measure mood. They do not grant authority. A democracy is supposed to be sturdier than a news cycle. And if the last decade of Trumpism has taught Americans anything, it is this. When MAGA says the people are with me, what they usually mean is stop asking questions. That is exactly when the questions matter most.